The first board split under her hammer, just as Dawn lifted the chill off the plane. The cracks sounded louder than it should have, sharp as a rifle shot in the empty morning, and she froze with a hammer raised, breath held, as if the land itself might answer back. Nothing did. Only wind slid to the tall grass and brushed against a blackened post that marked where a house had once stood. She lowered the hammer and wiped her sleeve across her mouth, tasting dust and old smoke. Her name was Eliza Ward, and she was 27 years old, though grief had already pulled faint lines beside her eyes. The boards at her feet were scavenged from the ruin of her own home, warped and half-burned, nails bent like crooked teeth. She set another in place, pressed her knee against it, and struck again. This time the nail held, shuddering into the wood with a dull, stubborn thud. 3 months ago, she had watched men lower her husband into ground at the edge of the creek. 3 months, and no one had come to help her raise new walls. She had stopped expecting it. The frontier did not reward waiting. A shadow stretched across the boards, long and still. Eliza did not look up at first. She knew who it belonged to. Everyone else kept their distance from a widow with no money and a claim others wanted. Only one man stood close enough to cast a shadow, and yet far enough to pretend he was not involved. Thomas Ward leaned against a fence rail that had survived the fire. He was 34, taller than his brother had been, with the same dark hair cut short and the same deep-set eyes, though his carried none of her husband's warmth. His coat hung open, dusted with travel, and his hands rested easy at his sides, as if ready but unwilling. He had been there since sunrise, watching her work without offering a word. Eliza drove another nail and finally turned. "If you're going to stare," she said, voice rough from disuse, "you may as well do it from closer. I won't bite." Thomas's jaw tightened. "You're wasting your strength," he said. "That one won't hold through winter." She shrugged and reached for another board. "Neither will I without a roof. You should go into town." "And beg." She met his eyes then, daring him to say it. "Or sell what little's left for nothing and leave my husband in the ground behind me?" His gaze dropped just for a moment. The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument. When he spoke again, his voice was low. "This land is trouble." "So was he," she said, softer now, and turned back to her work. Behind her, Thomas said nothing more. The wind rose, carrying the smell of ash and cut grass, and the sun climbed higher, bright but cold, showing every scar the fire had left behind. The sound of hooves came near midday, distant at first, then steady and deliberate. Eliza felt it before she heard it, a tightening in her chest that made her miss the nail and strike her thumb. She hissed, shook her hand, and looked up. 3 riders crested the low rise to the south, their shapes dark against the pale sky. Thomas straightened from the fence. His hand moved, not to a gun, but away from his body, open and loose. "Get inside," he said. "There is no inside," Eliza replied, though she stepped back all the same. The riders approached without hurry. Their horses were well fed, their tack clean, men with time and backing. The one in front, a broad man with a red scarf at his throat, tipped his hat as they drew near. "Morning," he said. "Mrs. Ward." Eliza lifted her chin. "You have the advantage of me." He smiled thinly. "Name's Cole Mercer. I ride for Mr. Halvorson." The name carried weight. Everyone knew it. Halvorson owned half the valley by paper or by threat. "We heard you were still here." "I am," she said. "You can see that." Mercer's eyes flicked to the half-raised shelter, the broken boards. "This claim's in dispute. Your husband's debts didn't die with him." Thomas stepped forward then, placing himself just ahead of Eliza. "There was no debt," he said. "Halvorson lost fair at cards, and he knows it." Mercer's smile vanished. "This isn't your concern. It became mine when my brother was buried on this land." The other 2 riders shifted. Hands brushed holsters. The air tightened, thin and sharp. Eliza's heart hammered, but she kept her voice steady. "You want me gone, say it." Mercer considered her. "We want this settled without trouble." "There's already been trouble," Thomas said. "Plenty of it." For a moment, Eliza thought Mercer might draw. Instead, he spat into the dust. "You've got until the week's end," he said. After that, we won't ask again." He turned his horse, the others following, and the sound of hooves faded back into the open land. Eliza let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. Her knees weakened, and she sat hard on one of the boards. The shelter creaked, a bitter, mocking sound. "You shouldn't have stepped in," she said to Thomas without looking at him. He crouched, picked up the hammer she had dropped, and set it beside her. "You shouldn't be alone out here." She laughed once, sharp and humorless. "Yet here I am." They stood in silence again, but it had changed. The threat had given it shape, edges. When a gust of wind caught the unfinished wall, the board shuddered and collapsed inward, falling in a clatter of wood and nails. Eliza flinched as if struck. Thomas moved without thinking, catching one board before it hit her. He held it, then set aside carefully. "Let me help," he said, not looking at her. "Just for today." She hesitated, then nodded. Survival did not leave room for pride. They worked until dusk, fitting what could be saved, bracing weak joints with stronger beams Thomas cut from a fallen cottonwood. He was quiet, methodical. Eliza watched his hands, so like her husband's, and felt the ache return, deep and steady. By the time the light faded, a rough lean-to stood where the ruins had been, imperfect but standing. Night came cold and clear. They lit a small fire, careful to keep it low. Eliza wrapped her coat tight and stared into the flames. "They won't wait," she said. "I know," Thomas replied. "Why are you really here?" The question had been waiting all day. He took a long moment before answering. "Because I told him not to trust Halvorsen. And when he didn't listen, I walked away instead of standing beside him." His voice roughened. "I won't do that again." Eliza closed her eyes. Grief and anger tangled, inseparable. When she opened them, she saw not a stranger, but a man carrying his own kind of ruin. The fire popped. Somewhere a coyote called. The shelter creaked, but held. For now, Eliza stood and set another board against the frame, marking where the wall would rise tomorrow. "Then we build," she said, "and we see who tries to tear it down." Thomas nodded once. The wind moved over the plain, indifferent and endless, as two figures sat beside a fragile wall and waited for what would come. By the second morning, the land felt smaller, as though it had drawn its breath and refused to release it. Eliza woke before the light reached the horizon, the lean-to holding just enough warmth to remind her what the cold could still take. Thomas was already awake, sitting with his back to a post, rifle across his knees, eyes fixed on the open plain. He had not slept much. She could see it in the way his shoulders stayed tight, as if he expected the world to rush them at any moment. They worked without speaking, reinforcing the shelter, shoring the weakest joints, dragging heavier boards into place. Every sound carried. Each hammer strike felt like an announcement. Eliza found herself pausing after each blow, listening for hooves, for voices, for the low murmur of men who believed time and ownership bent in their favor. Near mid-morning, Thomas stopped suddenly and held up a hand. Eliza froze. A single rider appeared on the rise to the east, moving slow, not trying to hide. It was not Mercer. This man rode alone, hat pulled low, posture loose in a way that suggested confidence rather than carelessness. He did not come closer. He watched, then turned his horse and vanished back over the hill. "They're measuring us," Thomas said. Eliza swallowed. "Then let them see we're still standing." Thomas looked at her, really looked, as if weighing something he had avoided since the fire. "If they come again," he said, "it won't be talk." She nodded once. Fear sat heavy in her chest, but beneath it, something harder had begun to form. The riders returned at dusk. For this time, they came fast, dust rolling ahead of them like a warning shot. Eliza barely had time to grab the rifle Thomas pressed into her hands before the first shot cracked the air. Wood splintered. The lean-to shuddered. "Stay low," Thomas shouted. Everything broke into motion. Horses screamed. Men yelled. Eliza crawled behind the shelter, heart pounding so hard it blurred her vision. She forced herself to breathe, to remember what Thomas had shown her only hours earlier. Load. Aim. Fire. Her shot went wide, but it made them scatter. Thomas moved like a man who had done this before and sworn never to again. He fired twice, precise, driving them back. One rider fell. Another dragged him clear. A bullet tore through Thomas's sleeve, grazing flesh. He did not slow. "Eliza," he called. "Now!" She ran when he ran. The two of them breaking toward the creek, bullets snapping through the air behind them. The water was cold enough to steal her breath. She stumbled, went under, came up choking. Thomas hauled her forward, never letting go. They crossed half blind, soaked and shaking, and kept moving until the dark swallowed them. They did not stop until land rose into rock and scrub, until the sounds of pursuit faded. Thomas collapsed first. Blood soaked his arm. Eliza tore her skirt to bind it, hands trembling, jaw set. "You should have left," she said, tears burning. He shook his head. "Not again." They hid until dawn. When the light came, it showed them what remained. Nothing behind them but smoke and broken ground. The shelter was gone. The land they had tried to hold had already been taken back by force. Eliza sat on a stone and stared at the horizon. "So that's it," she said. Thomas knelt beside her. "No, that was a warning." She turned to him, anger flaring through exhaustion. "And what do we do now?" He met her gaze. "We stop running." Silence stretched. Then Eliza stood. "Then we go back," she said. "Not to beg, not to hide, to finish this." Thomas nodded. Pain etched deep in his face, but resolve deeper still. Together, they turned toward a land that tried to break them, carrying nothing but the will to stand and see it through. They returned to the valley at first light, moving slow and deliberate, as if haste itself might draw fire. The land looked unchanged from a distance, wide and indifferent, yet Eliza felt the difference the moment her boots touched the familiar ground. This place had learned their names. Thomas walked beside her, his wounded arm bound tight, his jaw set in the way she had come to recognize as resolve rather than pain. He had insisted on coming. She had stopped arguing when she realized he would crawl if she tried to leave him behind. They did not go straight to the ruins. Instead, they circled high ground, watching the roads that cut to the plain like scars. By mid-morning, they saw smoke rising from Halvorson's spread, thick and steady, a sign of men awake and confident. Eliza felt anger flare, hot and sudden, but she held it down. Rage wasted breath. She needed clarity. Thomas studied the land, marking distance and cover, speaking only when necessary. "He'll expect us to come loud," he said. "Grief makes people reckless." Eliza smiled thinly. "Then let him be wrong." They approached from the creek side, using the low banks to hide their movement. Horses stamped near the corral. Voices carried, careless. Halvorson had brought men in, more than before, certain the threat had passed. Eliza felt the weight of that certainty pressing against her chest. She thought of the board she had raised, the shelter torn down, the grave by the water. She did not tremble. Whatever fear remained had been burned away. When they reached the edge of the yard, Thomas stopped. "Once this starts," he said quietly, "there's no taking it back." Eliza nodded. "I know." She stepped forward first. Halvorson was older than she expected. His hair silvered, his posture relaxed, as if violence were something handled by others. He looked up when he saw her, surprise flickering, then amusement. "You're persistent," he said. "So were my walls," Eliza replied. The laughter died fast. The first shot came from Thomas, sharp and clean, sending men scrambling. Chaos followed, loud and fast. Eliza moved with it, firing when she had to, shouting when she needed to. She did not aim to kill unless forced. This was not about blood. It was about ending something that had fed too long. Halvorson tried to run. Eliza caught him at the edge of the yard, rifle steady. "This ends now," she said. He sneered. "You think land cares who bleeds for it?" She answered with silence and pulled the trigger. The valley grew quiet by afternoon. Smoke drifted thin and pale. Thomas sank to the ground, breathing hard, but alive. Eliza stood beside him, shaking only now that it was over. She looked across the land, seeing not what it had taken, but what it had failed to break. They buried the dead where they fell, marked the ground, and left the rest of time. When they returned to the ruins, Eliza picked up a board and set it straight. Thomas joined her, wordless. Together they began again, slower, stronger. The frontier did not forgive. It tested, and this time they endured